Hi everybody. This will show you the use of survey codings for measuring education in cross-cultural surveys, work that has been done in the framework of the EU project Synergies for Europe's Research Infrastructures in the Social Sciences. My name is Silke Schneider. In this talk, I will show you how to use survey codings for measuring education in surveys, and it's most useful for cross-cultural surveys. This is work resulting from a project that I worked on with Verena Ottmans for several years, but also Jessica Herzing, now at Force in Lausanne, and Roberto Briceno-Rosas in a different project at GACES now. About myself, a few words. I'm a sociologist. I did my PhD on the cross-national measurement of education in surveys, and that's now, believe it or not, 10 years ago. I work at GACES Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Mannheim, and between 2013 and 17, I led a project called Computer-Assisted Measurement and Coding of Education in Surveys, or short CAMCAS, which laid the groundwork for the work I'll present here and which was continued in the SERISS project. I also work as a consultant for various cross-national surveys, such as the European Social Survey, the Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe, etc., to support them with their cross-national measurement of education. So here is a brief outline of the questions I will look at with you. First of all, to start, we'll just check what actually education means in the context of survey research, why we want to measure it in surveys, how it is usually measured and harmonized in surveys, how the survey codings tools can improve the measurement and harmonization of education, which standard classification supports the harmonization of education using survey codings, and that's quite an important point. Then also what the survey codings questionnaire for education looks like, and finally also whether you can access the education database that you will learn about during this talk directly. So what's meant by education in the context of survey research? Usually we use education as a shorthand for educational attainment, which is the highest formal education program completed by the respondent. It's quite important to distinguish this from non-formal education, such as continuing training or other less regular and less formalized and organized types of learning experiences. Education attainment focuses on the vertical differentiation in education, and there's also a separate presentation on fields of education which denote the horizontal differentiation in education, such as differences between sociology, political science, economics, but also in vocational fields. When we measure education in surveys, we focus on the outputs of the formal education system for the individual, and this means that the formal educational qualification is our main indicator for educational attainment. Why is education important to be measured in surveys? Well, it is maybe very, very obvious, but I'll state it anyway, because often we use measures of education also in our empirical analysis without really thinking about the reasons why we want to measure or control for it. It's really the most central background variable in surveys of individuals next to age and sex. It is important because it's an indicator for human capital, which is very important in determining people's labor market chances and therefore also life chances and outcomes, their trainability, but also their cultural capital, which is a bit more broad than just human capital. And these things are pretty much reflecting the socialization that an individual has received in the formal education system. Often education is also used as an indicator for social status because it has an important influence on labor market outcomes, such as occupation and incomes. But for social status, there's actually better indicators, which we sometimes, however, may not have. Education is also an indicator for cognitive skills and abilities, but also research shows that attainment across countries only explains about 25% of the variation in literacy or numeracy skills. So it is, again, not the greatest proxy measure for cognitive skills, but often everything that we have. How is education measured and harmonized in cross-cultural surveys? And I'll be very brief on this. I already said that educational qualifications are the most important indicator for educational attainment. And that is because qualifications are more reliable and valid than measuring years of education, for example, by asking people directly how long they've been in education, because that's quite a difficult question depending on how complex an educational system is or how complex one's educational career was. And you really have to be quite numerate to sometimes add up all those years you spend in different parts of the education system. So when we look at educational qualifications, however, we have very idiosyncratic differences in educational institutions across countries, which also means that we cannot translate the names of educational qualifications. Just as an example, take the English word bachelor. If you use the kind of seeming equivalent in French, baccalaureat, it denotes a very different level of education. So be very wary of translating anything in the area of education. This implies that we need to use country-specific education categories in measuring education in survey questionnaires and output harmonize those after data collection, which means we recode the national categories into an international coding scheme, which ideally we have specified before starting to collect the data. This entails substantial logistics, however, and is quite effortful for many surveys if you really want to ensure comparability. And if you do not do any centralized coordination and control of this, you may end up with pretty inconsistent and incomparable data across surveys because countries interpret international coding schemes quite differently. We also have the specialty of migrant surveys. In migrant surveys, a lot of the people in our samples have actually been educated abroad. And here it's, of course, very difficult to use country-specific education categories because migrants come from so many different countries that it is logistically often not possible to ask them for their education with country-specific categories reflecting the education system of their country of origin. So very often migrant surveys use pseudo-international categories using terms like primary or secondary education or higher education, which can, however, be interpreted quite differently across people from different origin countries. So there is always the question of how valid, reliable, and comparable the resulting data are. But even in general population samples, we find migrants these days, quite a lot of them, and people with foreign qualifications, not only migrants, but also people who've just studied abroad for a few years. And this is difficult to handle with our standard measurement instruments, which only use the educational qualifications from the country in which the survey is taking place. Another thing which is common in surveys when measuring education is that the response lists need to be quite short. And that's independent of whether the survey is computer assisted or not, because it takes a lot of time and is quite burdensome for respondents to read long lists of educational qualifications. But in light of the increasing differentiation of educational systems, just think about the Bologna reforms and the multiplication of kinds of higher education institutions in many countries. If you have short response lists, the list will be quite incomplete in many cases, or they become quite abstract, which again may make it difficult for respondents to respond to them. So how can survey codings improve the measurement and harmonization of education? Firstly, foreign qualifications are directly measured because we have designed a questionnaire in such a way to result in context-sensitive measures. And I show you how that works and what that means. In the questionnaire, we have introduced a question that explicitly asks where the respondent has completed the highest level of education or obtained the highest qualification. And depending on which country the survey takes place, this list will then look as follows. For example, for the United Kingdom, it would look like this. So either you have completed your education in the UK or abroad, and if it was in the UK, the Scottish system is actually quite different from the one in England, Wales, or Northern Ireland. So you can already shorten the lists and make them a bit more pertinent to the specific respondent by separating out these different educational systems. Everybody who studies education in Britain actually knows that the education system is quite messy and difficult to understand even for people who live in the UK and have been educated there. So if somebody here says that they obtained the highest educational qualification abroad, they actually get a follow-up question which asks them where specifically they obtained the highest educational qualification. And here we have implemented a long list of countries pretty much all countries in the world, which you can search through or scroll through and select, so that you then get the question on educational qualification just offering those qualifications as response categories that are relevant in that country. And I'll show you later what that actually looks like. So that's, I think, a great improvement, particularly for surveys of migrants, where you are interested in getting good measures of people's actual qualifications and not what respondents think is the equivalent of their qualification in the country in which they are interviewed. So secondly, in terms of how the survey codings can improve the measurement of education, I explained earlier that standard surveys usually need to use short lists because long lists are very difficult to administer in a survey. Again, if we have a computer-assisted survey, we can use innovative questionnaire design to enable long lists, which can better reflect the increasing differentiation of educational systems. And this can look as follows. We actually have developed two interfaces for this. One, the so-called combination box, is basically a search field. So you can do a search in the educational system, which you have indicated earlier, across all educational qualifications. So you search in the education database that underlies all these tools via a text entry box. And there is an algorithm that was programmed in such a way as to show most relevant results first. And then you select the best match. It may not always be successful because you need to know your educational qualification off the top of your head to be able to type it in, and you also have to be motivated to type it in. It also may need a bit more instructions than the search tree that I'll show next. So here is what the combination box looks like. It's really basically almost looks like an open question, but it also has this looking glass and the search watermark in the search field to signal to respondents that they're actually, it's not an open question, but they're searching a database. We also have these instructions here to not type the subject area or occupation because respondents otherwise tend to mess up these concepts quite a bit. The search tree, the second interface in the questionnaire to access the database, is the search tree, which is a bit like a show card, but can be more detailed because it nests qualifications in broader categories. This can either be used as a fallback for respondents that don't find a good match with the combination box, but it can also be used standalone because for some countries we don't have so much detail in the educational system to be worthwhile, to make the search worthwhile. The search tree doesn't require you to memorize or to know your educational qualification off the top of your head. You can read through the list and then check whatever makes most sense for you. But that also may mean that there is a bit of social desirability bias or rounding because people may not make so much effort and may rather use a higher qualification than they actually have to impress. And we know that even objective data like education are unfortunately subject to impression management as well. It does require more reading and therefore may be a bit slower than the combination box. Here's what it looks like. I have the example of the search tree for the UK here, and here you can already see how complex the system there is. It was quite difficult to order and sort the education qualifications in the UK in such a nested list. But now, if you now click on one of the entries where you think that your qualification will be included, it will look like this. You say you have a university degree, and then you can check at a second level the kind of university degree that you have. Now to the third way in which survey codings can improve the measurement of education. One advantage is that the responses shown to respondents are standardized across surveys because a central database underlies these lookups. Because currently all surveys redevelop their instruments from scratch, sometimes taking inspiration from other surveys, but usually it's not the same measurement instruments. And so getting more standardized measurement instruments would also mean that we get more comparable data across sources and surveys. So there's really, for every country or education context, there is one search tree interface and one database underlying the search box across all surveys. So individual surveys don't need to redesign. The combination box also works the same for all countries and respondents because the algorithm is standardized. However, if individual surveys start tweaking these algorithms, which they could do, because it's all open source, that will, of course, mean that standardization is going down again. We'll also need to revise the database because of educational reforms taking place, or we will find errors, I'm sure, which means that we will also not be able to perfectly standardize these things in the long run. That as a caveat. Now, the fourth advantage of using survey codings, and that's a really big one, I think, is the transparent, consistent, and the almost effortless harmonization of national education categories into international categories. And let me show you how that works. So in the survey, the respondent selects an educational qualification from the database using one of the questionnaire interfaces, the search tree or the combination box that I've shown you before. The survey system records a unique code for this educational qualification, which is basically a database entry. And the survey codings website provides the syntax to recode this unique qualification code into internationally harmonized variables. So this is really neat. You get your data out of the survey system, run a recode, and you have harmonized your data. Awesome, isn't it? Now let's look a little bit more into the international harmonized variables that you can code from the survey codings education tool. And the backbone here is UNESCO's International Standard Classification of Education, because it's available for almost all countries in the world, and it's very established, even in survey research these days, although it wasn't developed for survey research. But there have been quite some improvements been made recently in applying this classification for the measurement of educational attainment. So in our education database, we have both the codes corresponding to the official ISCAT 1997 and ISCAT 2011 mappings. We, however, also have alternative ISCAT 2011 mappings, because the ISCAT mappings, that's quite undesirable. They are often subject to political influence as well, because they are developed by national education ministries, sometimes together with statistical offices, which means that politics enters the scene, unfortunately, which means that sometimes qualifications are classified in a way that makes the country's education statistics look good rather than achieve comparable data. And that's why we have also corrected some of the classification decisions in the official mappings to our own, applying ISCAT criteria. We also have included the ISCAT-based coding scheme used in the European Labour Force Survey, because that's often used as a benchmark survey, also for checking sample representativeness. So we thought that might be useful. And we also have in the database the ISCAT-based coding scheme that's used in the European Social Survey and the European Value Study. It's the variable called EduLevel B, and it's also a 3-digit coding system. So what does the survey codings questionnaire for education look like? So you've seen some of this before already. So first of all, we have an introduction that defines the scope of formal education. This introduction is only needed when using the combination box, so the search field, because it aims at clarifying the understanding of formal education for the respondent, so they know exactly what to type in. Secondly, we have the context or country question, which asks, where did you obtain your highest educational qualification? And if that is not the country of the survey, which is one of the response options, as you have seen before, there is the more detailed list of countries and education contexts to select from. And then, as the third question, is the crucial question, what is your highest educational qualification? And first of all, the interface offered is the combination box, if it is available for the context that was selected previously. If the combination box was not successful or not available, or switched off, the search tree is offered. And if the search tree still doesn't result in a valid response, an open question is being offered. For all countries that are not included in the education database yet, it's also an open question. Of course, you don't want to use that for a large number of people, so that's only really useful if you have few people from countries that are not covered by the database yet. Then there's also a few optimal questions, but we don't need to go into this here. This database of educational qualifications can also, of course, also be useful when you have already collected data on education and you have, for example, some open responses, verbatim responses that you would like to code ex post. And yes, you can access the education database directly on the web. And here we can again go to our website. And on the page education in the survey codings, there's also the database live search. Here in the live database search, you select the country. Here we can say United Kingdom again. Again, you find the autocomplete, which corresponds to the combination box and the search tree. And we can now, for example, go to our university degrees, select the 5-year bachelor's degree, and then here you find the different pieces of classification information. For example, in ISCAT 1997, a 5-year bachelor's degree is classified as ISCAT level 4A, L, which means it's a long ISCAT 5 higher education degree, which gives access to the PhD level. Or in ISCAT 2011, it would be, where do we have it? Here. It would be the 3-digit code 760, master's level education with unspecified orientation. So we don't know whether it's a professional or an academic one. This is it to look at the live database. And you can, of course, play around with this. And I'll go back to the presentation. You can find out more when browsing through the education section on the survey codings page. And if you have any questions, if you find any errors, I'm sure you will, you can email us, both myself and my colleague Verena. And with this, I would like to finish and say thank you very much for listening. Bye.